What in the world are we supposed to do? What in the world are we supposed to do? That's really, I guess, in some ways what Lent is all about. Our actions, our behavior, what we're supposed to do, and taking a serious look at how we stand with God. I talked last week, or at least was trying to talk last week, about the difference between morality and spirituality. Morality, in many ways, is not necessarily connected to our life of faith. It's in part, a major part, I think, stemming from our culture. It's part of our social world of relationships and responsibilities. And often that area of morality is placed into the care, outsourced to whatever religious institutions have evolved in any particular society, but the dictates of any particular moral regimen come more from utility than they do from spirituality. Now, many factors other than faith influence what expectations we have for people, for how we act, what we do, how we judge other people around us. Morality impacts spirituality. It's not totally divorced from it. It impacts it really in its elimination of distractions that keep us from cultivating a spiritual life. A good example of that really is the development and missionary effort of Christianity on the American frontier. In the South and in the West, as Christianity was taken to these formerly unchurched places, there was a large focus on morality, on drunkenness and violence and sexual license and cleanliness, all those kinds of things, because the preachers had to deal with those things before people's attention could move to God. The trouble is that in a lot of American religion, they got stuck. And that's as far as they went. So that in much American religion, just being good or being nice is confused with being Christian, seen as synonymous. It was, though, a very distracting environment, and those things couldn't be ignored. The moral sphere also touches the spiritual in the experience of conscience. I'm pretty sure that I've told this story before in a sermon, but I think it was long enough ago that those of you who are old enough to remember it are also old enough not to remember it. Now, if I just told it last fall and I don't remember it, that's another issue. But when I was in 5th grade, I was caught trying to steal something from the Osco drugstore in Iowa City. And actually, I'd already stolen something, and I went back and was trying to steal something from my friend Mike, who was with me. I say that to let everybody know that even as a thief, I was quite a nice person. Generous to a fault. But the manager caught us and caught me and caught us and called the police. And my friend and I were met by a police car into which Debbie Bickle saw us enter. Debbie was our classmate and had the same birthday as I did. Same birthday as we do, Pat. It's the Paul Revere's Ride and the Tokyo Raid of Jimmy Doolittle. Anyway, Debbie saw us. I digress. And we were taken down to the station, and we talked to Officer Snyder. And he said that he wasn't going to tell our parents, but he wanted us to go home and tell them. So I knew, you know, if he didn't hear from my parents, he'd know I hadn't told them. So I knew I had to tell him, and I walked home very slowly, imagining going into my oblivious, happy parents and just ruining their lives. But it didn't turn out as bad as I'd expected to, and I mean, maybe they weren't as oblivious as I thought. You know. But I remember going to church with my family the next day, and it was the 5th Sunday of the month, I remember. In those days, we had services of morning prayer on the 2nd and 4th Sunday. We only had communion on the 1st and 3rd Sundays. But whenever there was a 5th Sunday, they had a service that was called anti-communion. Not anti-communion, it's not a super Protestant thing, but it's anti-communion. And that was basically the first part of the communion service. It was the communion service up until the consecration prayer, so that you did everything except consecrate the bread and wine and eat and drink it. And I don't know why they did that, but I always had a kind of a thought that maybe, see, it was shorter than either of the other two services, and it allowed the congregation to get out to the athletic club for brunch before the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church next door to the athletic club got out and got in line, and there weren't any more hash browns available. That was my thought. Anyway, one part of the anti-communion service, like the penitential order in our 1979 prayer book that we did on the first Sunday of Lent, goes through the 10 commandments. Say the commandment, say, Lord, have mercy upon us and incline our hearts to keep this law, I remember. And when they got to thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, I was killed. I made every effort not to dive under the pew, because there was this lightning bolt of judgment that came down on me, and I just felt it. And it was my first deep awareness that you couldn't ever hide from God, even if you work things out with the police or work things out with your family. That was there. Conscience, the experience of conscience, is a window on the truth through this avenue of behavioral demand. And although there are times when we manage to pull down the blinds on that window, times when we're distracted and don't look through the window, or times when we look and just imagine that we're seeing something, but when it's really there, that sense of guilt and of shame, that pang of conscience, which is just as physical as it is mental, really, makes it clear, to me at least, that there is a power, there is an authority, there is a reality beyond ourselves, beyond our desires and our personal fears, that has a claim on us, that has a claim on our behavior, that we have to take into account, that has a claim on our will, on our judgment. And morality at its best, when it's not simply social conformity or trying to blend in, trying to get away with what we can, is a response to that call of conscience. And at its depth, I think, at that point where there's a connection with spirituality, that morality is both simpler and more complicated than we usually think. Or at least more simpler and more complicated than our standard understanding of the rules and regulations of proper social behavior. In the way that follows Jesus, our tradition, for example, there aren't 613 commandments that have been drawn from the law and innumerable amplifications and applications of those that were developed by the rabbis in that tradition. There aren't even really much emphasis on 10, except on the fifth Sundays, maybe. It's just one. It's just love. Deuteronomy says, before Jesus picked up on it, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And Leviticus adds, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says it's on those two, that all the law and the prophets are based. And those two are really just one, love. If we love, we don't have to steal. We don't have to murder. We don't have to dishonor. We don't have to lie. If we love, we won't get distracted. If we love, we don't have to be afraid. Fear, I think, if you look at it, more and more, I think that fear is behind and at the base of all sin. But the first letter of John says, perfect love casts out fear. The hard part comes in applying that simple commandment to what happens in life. What brings about the most love in each situation can change from time to time, from person to person, from context to context. I mean, societies need very codified laws, consistent and applicable. And they probably also need even higher expectations that are enforceable only outside the courts. But those too have to be clear and known and able to be set down. But the call of conscience isn't so easily riveted. It's not pinned down. It can't be just technically satisfied by making sure you dot all the I's and cross all the T's. Making sure your trash is emptied, that all the non-disclosure agreements get signed. We know love when we do it, when we feel it, and when we fail, when we fall short and miss the mark. We know that. And that's where the epistle comes in to really up the ante on love. By grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It's a gift of God. So that to love enough, not to steal, not to kill, not to lie, not to covet, is not something we can invent by ourselves. It's something we just need to open up to. It's free. When in 5th grade I felt that sting of conscience, I was also opened up in a way that when the priest pronounced the absolution following the confession, I felt that love. I felt that forgiveness wash over me like a warm wave. I felt a sense of being accepted and a basic acceptability that I couldn't mess up, that went beyond any embarrassment I felt in front of Debbie Bickle or any police warning or parental disappointment. Now, of course, it wasn't a one-time thing where after that incident I was set on the straight path from then on out. There have been other and more serious confrontations with my conscience. Things done and not done that I can never really make up for. But that sense of being loved by God stayed with me. And I believe it contributed to the leap of faith that it took to follow my call to ministry, to the life that I've led since then. I think any calling into a life lived in truth takes a real leap of faith. So the question of what in the world are we supposed to do moves, I think, inevitably, if we follow it, into the question of who in the world are we supposed to be? Who is this? What's this unique life that I'm living with God, that God is living in me? Morality as such, even a well thought out and a truly lived morality, is still a surface kind of thing. It's part of the world that the New Testament at least talks about. Not always evil, but not really very deep. We can get stuck on that surface, whether we, get addicted to sin in some way through the constant round of following whatever whim we have, and then evasion and discovery and apology and whatever. Sometimes I wondered whether or not I kept getting in trouble because that felt so good when I received forgiveness. But we can also get stuck there through obsessive obedience, through the delusion that being good is all that matters, and that being good only involves following the rules. Conscience calls us to go deeper than that, to the foundations of our behavior, to our true identity, that we simply need to be open to underneath all the stories that we tell, our true self in God's eyes. And when we can stand in the world as that true self, or sit or kneel or lie down, if that's what's necessary, I think we can realize that true self, that life that we have, rests on something deeper still, because what we do and who we are depends on how we are. And how we are is by the grace of God. If anybody asks you in passing, whether they mean it or not, how are you? Instead of saying, oh, just fine, saved by the grace of God. That's how we are. And God is why we are as well. Why anything is. Why everything is. And when we come to that awareness, Lent moves into Easter. Thanks be to God.